Montana, 1878. A land where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams, and the frost doesn't just bite. Numbness is a luxury the dying cannot afford. Caleb Sterling was a man who had already lost his soul to the bank and his strength to the dirt, standing alone on a ranch that was more graveyard than home. But in the heart of a lethal blizzard, a silhouette emerged from the white void. Not the law, not a debt collector, but a woman with eyes like a stormy sea and hands as scarred as the earth itself. She didn't come seeking mercy. She came to strike a deal that would defy every law of the frontier. Who was Clara Vance, and why did she possess a fortune she refused to spend while working like a slave? Stay with us as we uncover a tale where the most dangerous thing isn't the cold, it's the truth. Welcome to our channel, the home of the great American West. Here, we tell the raw, unfiltered stories of the lonesome frontier, the unbreakable bonds of love, the depths of a mother's heart, and the profound compassion that binds one human soul to another in the face of impossible odds. This story reminds us that true wealth isn't found in a bank draft, but in the courage to see another person's worth when the rest of the world sees only a price tag. It is a lesson in healing and the power of standing together. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join our campfire. Your support keeps these legends alive.
The frost was a thief. It didn't just bite at the skin, it reached past the muscle and settled deep into the marrow, stealing the breath from Caleb Sterling's lungs before it could even form a cloud in the brutal Montana dawn. He swung the heavy iron hammer. Crack! The sound was sharp, brittle, immediately swallowed by the howling wind of November 1878. The nail bit into the splintered pine of the fence post, screeching in protest. Caleb's hands were numb, encased in leather work gloves that had worn through at the thumbs 2 winters ago. His knuckles were split beneath the hide, weeping slow, dark blood that froze before it could drip. He struck the nail again, harder this time, driving it flush against the wood. He didn't stop to admire the work. There was no time for pride on a dying patch of dirt. A few yards away, half buried in a fresh snowdrift, lay the stiff, unmoving shape of a yearling calf. It had frozen in the night. That was the 3rd one this week. Caleb didn't look at it. If he looked at it, he would have to do the math. He would have to calculate the cost of the lost beef against the ledger sitting on the battered oak table inside his cabin, a ledger that was currently bleeding him dry. Caleb leaned against the newly mended fence, dropping his forehead to his forearms, letting the hammer hang heavy in his right hand. He was a man built for endurance, tall and broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the very granite of the surrounding mountains. But exhaustion was a different kind of predator. It didn't hunt you. It just waited for you to stop running. The debt was a physical weight on his back. It felt heavier than the timber he hauled, heavier than the frozen earth he tried to plow. 3 years ago, he had taken a gamble. He had mortgaged the Sterling Ranch, the land his father had bled for, the land his mother was buried under, to invest in a modern irrigation system. He wanted to turn this stubborn, arid soil into something that would last. But the system failed. The pipes burst in an early freeze, the crops withered, and the bank smiled that polite, predatory smile. Silas Thorne, the banker in town, wasn't a man who broke legs or burned down barns. He was far worse. He was a man of paper and ink. Thorne would take a man's livelihood, his dignity, and his family name with the scratch of a fountain pen, all while offering a sympathetic nod. And in 3 weeks, Thorne's pen would cross out the name Sterling on the county deed. Caleb stood up, forcing his lungs to expand against the cold. The town already looked at him like a walking corpse. He could see it in the eyes of the mercantile owner when he asked for credit. He could hear it in the hushed whispers outside the saloon. Caleb Sterling, the fool who thought he could outsmart the dirt. His pride, the fortress he had built around himself since he was a boy, was crumbling into dust. He bent down, grabbed the frozen calf by its stiff hind legs, and began the grueling drag toward the burn pile behind the lower pasture. The friction of the carcass against the snow made a hollow, scraping sound. It was the sound of his failure. He had nothing left. No hands to help him, no money to hire them, and barely enough food to keep his own heart beating. He was entirely, profoundly alone. He reached the edge of the tree line and dropped the calf's legs, his chest heaving. As he straightened up, wiping a mixture of sweat and melting snow from his brow, his old blue heeler Barnaby let out a low, rumbling growl from the porch of the cabin. Caleb narrowed his eyes, squinting through the driving snow. Down at the end of the long, winding drive, where the Sterling property met the main county road, a silhouette was moving. It was walking toward the house, fighting against the gale, taking one agonizing step at a time. Caleb instinctively reached for the rifle leaning against the woodpile. It wasn't malice, it was instinct. Out here, visitors in a blizzard were rarely bearing good news. Usually they were carrying a foreclosure notice or a gun. He thumbed the hammer of the Winchester back, feeling the cold steel through his glove, and waited. As the figure drew closer, the blur of the storm began to peel away. It wasn't Silas Thorne. It wasn't the county sheriff. It was a woman. Caleb lowered the barrel of the rifle, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. She was trudging through knee-deep drifts, dragging a worn leather satchel behind her. She wore a heavy wool coat that was clearly a man's, 2 sizes too big, the hem dragging in the snow and caked with frozen mud. A woolen scarf was wrapped tight around her head and lower face, leaving only her eyes exposed. When she finally reached the clearing near the porch, she stopped. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry out for help. She just stood there, swaying slightly in the wind, catching her breath. Caleb stepped out from the shadow of the barn, the rifle resting casually but visibly in the crook of his arm. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," Caleb called out, his voice a low, gravel pit, loud enough to cut through the wind but completely devoid of warmth. "And you're walking on private land. What's left of it?" The woman slowly pulled the woolen scarf down from her face. Her skin was pale, chapped raw by the wind, and her lips were a bruised shade of blue. But her eyes, they stopped Caleb dead in his tracks. They were a piercing, stormy gray, and they held absolutely no fear. There was no plea for mercy in them, no damsel in distress vulnerability. They were the eyes of a cornered wolf. "Are you Caleb Sterling?" Her voice was hoarse, raspy from the cold, but steady as a heartbeat. "I am," Caleb said, his grip tightening marginally on the rifle. "If you're selling something, I have no money. If you're looking for charity, the church is 6 miles back the way you came." "I'm not selling, Mr. Sterling," Clara Vance said, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch. "And I would rather freeze to death in your driveway than ask a man like you for charity." Caleb blinked, taken aback by the sheer audacity of the statement. He looked at her satchel, then back to her frozen face. "Then what do you want?" "I want a job." Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the whistling wind. Caleb stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he let out a short, hollow bark of a laugh. It sounded foreign in his own throat. "A job," he repeated, shaking his head. He gestured with his free hand toward the dilapidated barn, the rotting fences, and the dead calf, half buried in the snow. "Does this look like a place that's hiring, ma'am? I'm bankrupt. I don't have 2 pennies to rub together, let alone wages to pay a woman to cook and mend." "I didn't come to cook or mend," Clara said sharply. She took a step closer, closing the distance between them. Caleb noticed then that she wasn't wearing delicate ladies' boots. She was wearing men's leather work boots, heavily scuffed and laced tight with thick twine. She pulled off her right glove. She held her hand out, palm up in the freezing air. Caleb looked at it. It was a hand that knew pain. The fingers were calloused, the joints thick, the skin scarred and rough. It was not the hand of a parlor lady. It was the hand of someone who had fought the earth and lost, but kept fighting anyway. "I can swing an axe," Clara said, her voice dropping lower, cutting straight through the bullshit. "I can mend a fence. I can muck a stall, pull a breech calf, and I can balance a ledger better than any drunken cowboy you could haul out of the saloon. I will do the work of 2 full-grown men." Caleb stared at her hand, then slowly met her gray eyes. "I told you. I can't pay you." "I didn't ask for money," Clara shot back, pulling her glove back on with a sharp snap. "I know about your debt to Silas Thorne. The whole county knows. I am offering you a trade. My labor from before the sun comes up until long after it goes down. In return, I want a dry place to sleep in that barn and 1 hot meal a day. That is the price." Caleb was entirely unsettled. This wasn't how the world worked. Desperate people begged. They wept. They negotiated from their knees. This woman was standing in a blizzard, freezing to death, and she was dictating terms to him like a rail baron. "Why?" Caleb asked, his voice losing its rough edge, replaced by a genuine, weary curiosity. "You could go into town. The mercantile needs clerks. The hotel needs maids. You could get a warm bed and actual wages. Why come to a dying ranch and offer to work like a mule for nothing?" Clara looked past him, her eyes scanning the dilapidated barn, the rolling snow-covered hills, and the dark timberline beyond. For a fraction of a second, Caleb thought he saw a flicker of something deeply vulnerable flash across her face. A phantom grief, quickly buried beneath a fortress of ice. "Because I don't want to be in town," Clara said, bringing her gaze back to his. "And because I need a place where the work is so hard, I don't have the energy to think when the sun goes down." She picked up her leather satchel, the strap groaning under the weight. "Do we have a deal, Mr. Sterling? Or should I turn around and let you freeze to death trying to save this place by yourself?" Caleb looked at her. He looked at his own bleeding hands. He thought of the foreclosure notice, the dead cattle, and the crushing, suffocating silence of the cabin. He was drowning, and this strange, hard woman had just offered him a jagged piece of driftwood. It might splinter and sink them both, but it was better than treading water. Caleb stepped aside, clearing the path to the barn. "The roof leaks over the 3rd stall," Caleb said, his voice quiet, stripped of its former hostility. "There's fresh hay in the loft. I'll bring out some blankets and whatever's left of the stew from last night." Clara didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She simply gave a single curt nod, adjusting her grip on the heavy satchel. "I expect to be woken at 5, Mr. Sterling," she said, walking past him. Caleb watched her trudge toward the dark, looming structure of the barn. He stood in the snow for a long time, the cold biting at his skin. But for the first time in 3 years, the crushing weight on his chest felt just a fraction lighter. He hadn't hired a maid. He hadn't taken on a charity case. He had just made a deal with a survivor. And as Caleb turned back to face the frozen wilderness, he realized that in this unforgiving land, a survivor was exactly what he needed. The first week was an education in silence. Caleb had lived alone for 3 years, ever since his father's heart had given out halfway through the spring planting. He was accustomed to the quiet. But the silence Clara Vance brought with her was of a different breed. It wasn't the empty, hollow quiet of a lonely house. It was a heavy, deliberate silence. It was the silence of a tightened jaw, of a body pushed to its absolute physical limits, of secrets locked behind a rib cage. They did not speak unless it was strictly necessary. There was no polite chatter about the weather. The weather was a mutual enemy that required no introduction. There were no inquiries about past lives. They were 2 ghosts haunting the same graveyard, mutually agreeing to ignore the headstones. Clara was a creature of punishing routine. True to her word, she was awake by 5 every morning. Caleb would step out onto the freezing porch, his breath pluming in the dark, and see the faint yellow glow of the kerosene lantern already moving through the drafty slates of the barn. She took over the most brutal chores without being asked, and more importantly, without asking for permission. She mucked the stalls, wielding the heavy wooden pitchfork with a rhythmic, mechanical efficiency. She hauled water from the half-frozen pump, her small frame leaning entirely backward to counterbalance the weight of the sloshing iron buckets. Caleb watched her from the corner of his eye, waiting for her to break. He waited for the morning she wouldn't get up, or the evening she would march up to the cabin door and demand her wages in exchange for leaving. She never did. Instead, a strange, unspoken language began to develop between them, entirely devoid of words. It was a dialogue written in labor. On the fourth day, Caleb noticed that the dull, rusted blade of his splitting axe had been taken to the grinding stone. It sliced through the frozen pine logs like butter. He didn't thank her. Instead, that evening, he took a heavy wool blanket from his own bed, one he desperately needed, and quietly draped it over the wooden stall gate where she slept. The next morning, his leather work gloves, which had been split at the seams and stiff with dried blood, were sitting on the anvil. They had been meticulously stitched back together with thick wax twine, the leather rubbed soft with tallow. They were circling each other, maintaining a careful, respectful distance, connected only by the shared misery of the work. She was proving with every drop of sweat that she was not a burden. He was proving with every silent concession that he saw her effort. It was the purest form of equality Caleb had ever known. But the frontier does not allow for peaceful routines. It demands a toll. It happened on a Tuesday evening, just as the sky was bruising into a deep, violent purple. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in an hour, a sharp, terrifying drop that made the trees groan and snap in the woods. Caleb was in the tack room when he heard it, a frantic, high-pitched bleating carrying over the howl of the wind. He dropped the bridle he was oiling and bolted out the door. Clara was already running from the woodpile, a coiled length of hemp rope over her shoulder. She didn't look at him. She just pointed toward the lower creek bed. They ran. The snow was knee-deep, pulling at their legs like wet sand. When they reached the edge of the creek, Caleb swore under his breath, a harsh guttural sound. A young heifer, no more than 6 months old, had wandered out onto the ice trying to reach a patch of exposed winter grass on the opposite bank. The ice, thinned by the running water beneath, had given way. The calf was chest-deep in the freezing black water, thrashing wildly, its hooves scrabbling uselessly against the jagged ice shelf. Its eyes were rolled back in panic, the bleating growing weaker by the second. "It's going to go under," Caleb shouted over the wind. He didn't hesitate. He waded into the creek. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a sledgehammer to the chest that instantly drove the air from his lungs. The water was only waist-deep, but the mud at the bottom was thick, sucking at his boots, trying to drag him down. He reached the calf, wrapping his thick arms around its neck, trying to heave its front legs onto the solid ice. But the animal weighed 200 pounds, and in its blind terror, it thrashed its head, catching Caleb under the jaw with a solid skull butt. Caleb saw stars. He slipped, going down to his shoulders in the freezing water. Before he could find his footing, Clara was there. She hadn't stayed on the bank. She had plunged into the creek right behind him. The water was up to her ribs, soaking her heavy wool coat, turning it into a lead weight. Her lips were already blue, her skin deathly pale, but her gray eyes were burning with a fierce, manic focus. "Get the rope under her belly!" Clara screamed, tossing him one end of the hemp. Caleb grabbed it. He shoved his hands deep into the freezing water, feeling blindly through the thick, icy mud, until he passed the rope under the calf's chest. Clara caught the other end. "On 3!" she commanded. She didn't sound like a hired hand. She sounded like a captain on a sinking ship. 1, 2, 3! They pulled. The rough hemp bit into Caleb's numb hands, tearing open the fresh calluses. Clara leaned entirely backward, digging her boots into the slick mud of the creek bed, the tendons in her neck straining tight like bridge cables. With a sickening sloop of mud and a final desperate kick from the calf, they hauled the animal up over the lip of the ice. It collapsed onto the snowy bank, shivering violently. Caleb and Clara dragged themselves out of the water, falling to their knees in the snow beside the animal. For a long minute there was no sound but the howling wind and the ragged, gasping breaths of 3 freezing creatures. Caleb looked at Clara. Her coat was frozen solid, a literal armor of ice. Her hair had escaped its scarf, plastered to her face in wet, freezing strands. She was trembling so violently, her teeth were chattering in a rapid staccato rhythm. She looked up, catching his eye. For a second, the iron walls she kept around herself dropped. He saw the sheer, unadulterated exhaustion in her eyes. But then, a slow, ragged breath escaped her, and the ghost of a triumphant smirk touched the corner of her blue lips. "You're bleeding," she rasped, nodding to his jaw where the calf had struck him. "You're freezing," Caleb countered, his voice a low rumble. He pushed himself up on shaking legs. He didn't ask if she needed help. He knew better now. He bent down, scooped the shivering 200-pound calf into his arms with a grunt of exertion and turned toward the barn. "Walk," Caleb commanded her. "Don't stop. Just walk to the barn." They made it to the stable. Caleb dropped the calf into a stall piled high with dry straw. He grabbed 2 coarse wool blankets, throwing one over the animal and thrusting the other into Clara's chest. "Strip that coat off," he ordered, moving to the tack box. He dug past the brushes and hoof picks until he found what he was looking for: a battered tin flask of cheap, burning rye whiskey. He turned back. Clara had managed to peel the frozen coat off, but her hands were shaking too badly to manage the buttons of her soaked flannel shirt underneath. She stood in the dim lantern light, shivering uncontrollably, looking incredibly small without the oversized coat. Caleb stepped into her space. He didn't ask. He uncorked the flask with his teeth, wiped the rim with his thumb, and pressed it to her lips. "Drink. It'll burn the frost out of your lungs." Clara took a shuddering breath, wrapped her cold hands over his to steady the flask, and drank. She gagged as the cheap rye hit the back of her throat, coughing violently, but a faint flush of color immediately rushed to her pale cheeks. She pulled back, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, her gray eyes locking onto his. The space between them in the cramped stall suddenly felt charged, heavy with the smell of wet wool, animal heat, and rye whiskey. "Your turn," she whispered, her voice still trembling. Caleb took the flask, turning it so his mouth covered the exact spot hers had been, and took a long, burning pull. They stood there in the dim light, the storm raging outside, the rescued calf breathing steadily in the hay beside them. There were no declarations of affection, there were no gentle touches. It was a moment forged in mud, ice, and mutual survival. Caleb looked at this woman, this strange, fierce creature who had walked out of a blizzard to save his cattle and mend his gloves. And he realized with absolute certainty that he had completely underestimated her. "You did good today, Vance," Caleb said softly, the highest compliment he knew how to give. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her chin lifting with that familiar, stubborn pride. "I told you, Mr. Sterling," she replied, the rasp in her voice steadying. "I'm worth the wages you aren't paying me." The intrusion came 2 days later, carried on the wheels of a polished black buggy. Caleb was in the yard repairing a wagon wheel when the vehicle crested the ridge. Even from a distance, the buggy looked violently out of place against the jagged, snow-swept misery of the Sterling ranch. It was too clean, too sharp. It was a vehicle that belonged on paved city streets, not carving ruts into frozen mud. Clara was near the water pump. Caleb saw her freeze. She didn't stand up straight to watch the buggy approach. Instead, she subtly adjusted her posture, pulling her scarf higher over her face, turning her back to the road, and continuing her work with a sudden, rigid intensity. The buggy rolled to a halt near the porch. Out stepped Silas Thorne. Thorne was a man who understood the theatricality of power. He wore a heavy overcoat of imported Astrakhan wool, a stark contrast to Caleb's patched canvas. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, carefully stepping over the horse manure in the yard. He smelled faintly of bay rum cologne and expensive cigars, the sense of a man who never had to sweat for his supper. "Morning, Caleb," Thorne called out, his voice smooth, carrying an unbearable tone of sympathetic regret. "A cold one, isn't it?" Caleb didn't put down his tools. He slowly stood up, wiping the grease from his hands onto a rag. He felt the familiar hot flush of humiliation creeping up his neck. A man's home was supposed to be his castle. Out here, a man's land was his absolute sovereignty. But when Thorn stepped onto the dirt, Caleb felt entirely like a trespasser on his own property. "What do you want, Silas?" Caleb asked, his voice low and hard. "The month isn't up. You have 3 more weeks." Thorn sighed, adjusting his leather gloves. "I know, Caleb, I know. And legally, you are correct. But I was reviewing the accounts this morning. I heard about the cattle you lost to the frost this week. 3 head, was it? 4? Caleb's jaw tightened. The frontier was vast, but gossip traveled faster than the wind. "My cattle are my business. They are the bank's collateral, Caleb," Thorn corrected gently, though his eyes were cold. "I'm just trying to be realistic. You're bleeding out. The soil is dead, the herd is dying, and you are working yourself into an early grave to delay the inevitable. I have a buyer, a cattle conglomerate out of Chicago. They want to absorb this valley. If you sign the deed over to me today, I will forgive the remaining debt. And I'll give you enough cash to buy a train ticket west. Start fresh. Preserve your dignity. Preserve your dignity." The words tasted like ash in Caleb's mouth. "My dignity," Caleb said, taking a slow, menacing step forward, "is buried under that oak tree on the hill next to my mother. This land isn't for sale, Silas. Not today. Not in 3 weeks. I will have your money." Thorn smiled, a thin, pitying expression. He looked past Caleb, his eyes landing on the hunched, muffled figure of Clara by the pump. "I see you've taken on help," Thorn noted, his tone dripping with quiet disdain. "A drifter? Be careful, Caleb. Desperate people draw desperate company. I'll see you in 21 days. The sheriff will accompany me next time, for formalities, of course." Thorn climbed back into his buggy and drove away, leaving behind the smell of cologne and the crushing reality of the impending doom. Caleb stood in the yard, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. The shame was a physical fire in his gut. He had been stripped bare, evaluated, and dismissed as worthless on his own front lawn. He didn't look at Clara. He couldn't. He picked up his sledgehammer, walked to the woodpile, and began violently splitting logs. He swung with blinding, reckless rage, shattering the pine, trying to physically batter the humiliation out of his system. Later that afternoon, the wind picked up again, bringing the promise of another snowstorm. Caleb climbed into the high loft of the barn. He needed to patch a rotting section of the roof before the snow breached the hay reserves. The loft was dark, smelling of dust, dry grass, and old timber. Caleb moved carefully along the main crossbeams. The structural integrity of the barn was failing, just like everything else. He reached the far corner near the eaves and knelt to inspect a massive, load-bearing oak pillar that was showing signs of wet rot. He took his hunting knife from his belt and began to scrape away the spongy, blackened outer bark to see how deep the rot went. As the wood fell away in damp flakes, Caleb paused. There were grooves beneath the rot, deep, deliberate gouges in the solid heartwood. Frowning, Caleb brushed the dust away with his thumb, holding his lantern closer. The light flickered over the wood, throwing shadows into the carved depressions. It wasn't a structural flaw. It was a carving. It was a crude height chart. Small, horizontal notches climbed up the pillar, stopping about shoulder high. And next to the highest notch, carved an elegant sweeping script that looked deeply out of place on rough-hewn oak, were 3 words. "Clara Vance, 1860. Caleb stared at the wood, his breath catching in his throat. The lantern trembled in his hand. Vance. The name hit him like a physical blow. He knew that name. Every family in the valley knew that name. The Vances were the original homesteaders who had settled this tract of land 40 years ago. They had built the foundation of the cabin. They had dug the well. But they had fallen on hard times during a brutal drought before the war. Caleb's father, a shrewd man who believed in profit over neighborly grace, had bought the Vance mortgage from a ruthless Eastern bank and immediately foreclosed, forcing the family off the land with nothing but the clothes on their backs. It was the original sin of the Sterling Ranch, a foundation built on another family's ruin. Caleb's mind raced, spinning the puzzle pieces together. Clara. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't a stranger who had stumbled out of the snow. She knew exactly which stall roof leaked. She knew exactly how to fix the broken latch on the gate. She had been here before. This was her home. He sat back on his heels, a profound sense of unease washing over him. Why had she come back? Was it revenge? Was she waiting for him to fail so she could watch the Sterling legacy crumble into the same dust his father had forced upon hers? He needed to confront her. He needed to look her in those stormy gray eyes and demand the truth. Caleb climbed down the loft ladder, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt floor with a heavy thud. He walked toward Clara's stall. She was out in the pasture, checking the fence line before the storm hit. He intended to wait for her. But as he stepped into the small area she had claimed, a sudden violent gust of wind tore through the open barn doors. The wind caught the worn leather satchel Clara kept hung on a rusty nail above her bedroll. The leather, dry and brittle, snapped. The heavy bag hit the floor with a heavy metallic crash, bursting open. Caleb knelt immediately, instinctively moving to gather her sparse belongings before they scattered in the dirt. He reached for a pair of wool socks, a tin cup, and a small, heavy velvet box that had tumbled from the depths of the bag. The box hit the floor, the delicate brass latch springing open. Caleb reached to close it, but his hand froze. The box was not filled with cheap trinkets or sewing needles. It was stuffed with crisp, heavy-stock paper, legal documents. Caleb knew he shouldn't look. A man's privacy was sacred. But the name Vance was burning in his mind, and the urge to understand the woman who was sleeping in his barn overpowered his honor. He pulled the papers out. The first was a letterhead from a prestigious law firm in New York City. The second was a ledger detailing stock dividends. And the third was a bank draft issued by the First National Bank of Manhattan, made out to Clara Vance. Caleb stared at the numbers printed on the heavy paper, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. $15,000. It was a fortune. It was enough money to buy the Sterling Ranch, pay off Silas Thorne, build a mansion on the hill, and never work another day in her life. Caleb's hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from a sudden, blinding rush of betrayal. He thought of her plunging into the freezing creek. He thought of her hands, bleeding and calloused, shoveling manure for the price of a bowl of watery stew. He thought of the way she had looked at him, demanding a job, claiming she had nothing. It was a lie, all of it. The poverty, the desperation, the silent camaraderie forged in the dirt. She was a wealthy woman from the East, playing a twisted game of pioneer dress-up on the bones of his failing life. She was watching him bleed out, watching him suffer the humiliation of Thorne's threats, while sitting on a fortune that could save him with a stroke of a pen. He slowly folded the draft, placed it back into the velvet box, and shoved the box deep into the leather satchel. He stood up, his face a mask of cold, terrifying calm. The empathy he had begun to feel for her, the deep, unsettling respect evaporated, replaced by a bitter, dark fury. He had thought they were equals in misery. He had thought they were two drowning people clinging to the same raft. Instead, she was standing on the shore, watching him drown. Caleb walked out of the stall, pulling up a wooden chair to the center of the barn aisle. He sat down in the fading light, crossing his arms over his chest, listening to the wind howl. He didn't move. He just waited in the dark for Clara Vance to come home. The silence in the barn was no longer the heavy, companionable quiet of shared labor. It was the silence of a coiled rattlesnake. Caleb sat in the shadows, his silhouette a jagged monument of resentment. He didn't light a lantern. He let the twilight fade until the only light came from the blue-white reflection of the snow piling up outside the barn doors. He listened to the rhythmic thump-thump of his own heart. a drumbeat of betrayal. He felt like a fool. Every stitch she'd put in his gloves, every bucket of water she'd hauled, felt like a calculated insult, a wealthy woman's performance of poverty. When the barn door groaned open, a swirl of snow followed Clara inside. She moved with the stiff, weary gait of someone who had spent the last 4 hours fighting the wind. She didn't see him at first. She went straight to the calf's stall, murmuring a soft, low word to the animal, her voice carrying a tenderness she never offered Caleb. Then she turned toward her stall. She saw the dark shape of the chair. She saw the glint of Caleb's eyes. She froze. Her hand went instinctively to the scarf around her neck, pulling it tighter. "You're sitting in the dark, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice raspy and cautious. "The wind is getting worse. You should be in the cabin." "I was just thinking about value, Vance," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the timber. "About what things are worth and what people are worth." Clara stood perfectly still. The air between them was thick, charged with the ozone of an impending storm. Value is a simple thing out here. You work or you don't. You eat or you starve. Is it that simple? Caleb stood up slowly. He was a head taller than her, his shadow stretching across the dirt floor like a shroud. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small velvet box. He didn't hand it to her. He held it up in the dim light, his thumb tracing the brass latch. Clara's breath hitched, a sharp, jagged sound in the dark. "Your bag fell," Caleb said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The strap was rotten. I went to help and this tumbled out." He opened the box. The crisp white of the bank draft caught what little light remained. $15,000, Caleb whispered, the number sounding like a curse. "I've lived on this land my whole life. Worked it until my bones ached and my blood turned to ice, and I haven't seen a tenth of that in a single pile. You let me stand in the yard and take Silas Thorne's spit in my face. You watched me drag a dead calf through the snow this morning because I couldn't afford a heater for the barn. And all the while you had the price of this entire valley tucked under a nail in a horse stall." Clara didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Her face went as cold and hard as the Montana permafrost. "You had no right to go through my things." "I had no right?" Caleb's voice rose, a sudden violent crack of thunder. "I gave you my food. I gave you my warmth. I treated you like a partner because I thought you were as desperate as I was. I respected you, Vance. I thought you were the only person in this world who understood what it meant to have nothing. But you're just a tourist, a rich girl playing at being a martyr while I'm actually dying." He threw the box. It didn't hit her. It landed in the hay at her feet with a soft thud. "Get out," Caleb spat. "Take your money and your lies and get off my land. I'd rather lose this place to the bank than share it with a fraud." Clara didn't move toward the door. Instead, she took a step toward him, her eyes flashing with a sudden searing heat. "You think that paper makes me rich?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a rage that matched his own. "You think $15,000 buys a life? That draft is a death warrant, Caleb Sterling. It's the blood money my husband paid to keep me silent while he broke my ribs and locked me in a room for 3 weeks because I dared to ask for the ledger of my own father's estate." Caleb paused, his anger faltering for a split second. "My husband is a man of standing in New York," Clara continued, her voice breaking. "Under the law, I am his property. That money, I can't cash it. To the bank, I don't exist without his signature. If I walked into town and tried to use that draft, the telegraph wires would be buzzing before the ink was dry, and he would be on the next train to drag me back to the cage he built for me. I'm not a tourist. I'm a fugitive." She reached down and snatched the box from the hay, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "I came here because I had nowhere else," she sobbed, the first crack in her iron exterior. "I came here because this dirt is the only thing that ever felt like home, even if your father stole it from mine. I worked for you because I wanted to earn my breath. I wanted to feel like I wasn't an object to be bought or sold. I have nothing left to sell, Caleb. Not my soul, and certainly not that useless piece of paper. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was hollow. Caleb looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the tremors in her hands. He saw the way she looked at the bank draft, not with greed, but with genuine, unadulterated terror. He realized then the depth of his own blindness. He had been so consumed by his own poverty of coin that he hadn't seen her poverty of freedom. He had assumed that money solved everything because he had none. He hadn't realized that for some, money was simply the weight of the chains. "I didn't know," Caleb whispered, the fight leaving him. "Of course you didn't." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve, her voice regaining its jagged edge. "You were too busy feeling sorry for yourself. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a fence to check, since I'm still your hired hand until the storm hits." She brushed past him, leaving the scent of salt and cold air in her wake. Caleb stood in the dark, the velvet box a heavy ghost in the room, realizing that the woman he thought he knew was far more dangerous and far more broken than he ever could have imagined. The storm arrived that night not as a guest, but as an invader. By midnight, the wind was no longer a howl. It was a shriek that threatened to lift the shingles off the cabin roof. The snow didn't fall. It drove horizontally, a white sheet of glass that obliterated the world beyond the porch. Inside the cabin, Caleb paced the floor, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He looked at the empty chair across the table. He thought of Clara in the barn. He had told her to get out. He had insulted her, stripped her of the one thing she had left, her anonymity. He couldn't sleep. The image of those $15,000 chains wouldn't leave his mind. At 2 a.m., a terrifying sound cut through the roar of the wind, a sharp, rhythmic crack followed by a sickening groan of shifting timber. It came from the barn. Caleb didn't stop to put on his heavy coat. He grabbed his lantern and his boots and threw himself into the white void. The wind nearly knocked him off the porch. The 20 yards to the barn felt like 20 miles. Every breath was a struggle. The air was so thick with ice it felt like inhaling needles. He reached the barn doors and threw his weight against them. Inside, the air was a chaotic swirl of hay and dust. Lantern light flickered wildly. "Clara!" he roared. "Back here!" He found her in the rear stall, the one where the rotted oak pillar stood. The weight of the snow on the roof had finally pushed the structure past its breaking point. The main crossbeam had splintered, and the roof was sagging dangerously low over the livestock. Clara was standing beneath a secondary beam, her shoulder pressed against a temporary support post she had tried to wedge into place. Her face was drenched in sweat despite the freezing cold, her muscles jumping in her arms. "It's going to go," she yelled. "The horses! Get the horses out!" Caleb didn't go for the horses. He went for the axe. He grabbed the heavy felling axe from the wall. "Move, Clara! Get out of the way! If I move, the whole section collapses on the yearlings." Caleb ignored her. He swung the axe with a desperate, lung-bursting force, not at the roof, but at a fresh, solid timber he had hauled in weeks ago. He carved a notch into the wood with terrifying speed. "Hold on!" he screamed. He jammed the new timber next to her, using his own massive frame to shoulder the weight alongside her. For a moment, they were a single machine of flesh and bone, braced against the crushing weight of the world. Caleb felt the vibration of the roof groaning above them, the sound of wood screaming under tension. "Now, get the horses," Caleb grunted, his face turning purple with the effort. Clara slipped out from under the beam. She didn't hesitate. She ran to the stalls, throwing open the gates, slapping the horses' flanks to drive them toward the front of the barn. She worked with a frantic, selfless grace. Once the animals were clear, she ran back to Caleb. She didn't stand back. She grabbed a second support beam, helping him wedge it into place until the groaning of the roof settled into a dull, ominous creak. Caleb slumped against the pillar, his lungs burning, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Clara stood a few feet away, her chest heaving. They were both covered in dust and cobwebs, their hands raw and bleeding. "You came back," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Caleb looked at her. He saw the bruise on her shoulder where the beam had pressed. He saw the sheer, unadulterated courage in her eyes. The woman who had nothing left to sell, but was still willing to give everything to save a few head of cattle. "I was a fool, Clara," Caleb said, the words heavy and honest. "I spent so much time looking at the numbers on that paper that I forgot to look at the woman standing in front of me." He reached out, a hesitant, awkward movement, and touched her hand. Her skin was freezing, but her grip was like iron. "Thorne is coming in 2 weeks," Caleb said. "He wants to take this place. He wants to turn us both into ghosts." Clara looked at the splintered beam, then back at Caleb. "Then let's give him a haunting he'll never forget." In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. They weren't master and servant. They weren't debtor and drifter. They were two rebels in a war of survival. "I can't cash that draft, Caleb," Clara said, her voice turning sharp and analytical. "But I know the law. I know how men like Thorne work. They don't just use the law, they hide behind it. If we can't buy him off, we'll outthink him." Caleb nodded. He didn't know how they would do it. He didn't know how a bankrupt rancher and a fugitive wife could stop a bank. But for the first time since the frost hit, he wasn't afraid. "Get some sleep, Clara," Caleb said gently. "Tomorrow, we stop digging graves and start building a fortress." As he walked back to the cabin through the dying storm, Caleb realized that the most valuable thing on the Sterling Ranch wasn't the land, and it certainly wasn't the $15,000 in the velvet box. It was the woman in the barn who had taught him that the only real poverty was the loss of hope. The storm was still raging, but inside the barn, the roof was holding. And for now, that was enough. The morning after the blizzard, the world was a blinding, silent expanse of white. The wind had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the color of crushed turquoise and a cold so absolute it seemed to freeze the very light. Caleb kicked the cabin door open, using his shoulder to shove aside the 3-foot drift that had barricaded them in the night. The glare off the snow was physically painful, forcing him to squint as he waded toward the barn. The structure was still standing. The temporary brace they had wedged under the failing crossbeam held, though it groaned a dull, continuous complaint under the weight of the snow. When Caleb stepped inside, the smell of damp hay, horse sweat, and manure hit him, the earthy, grounding scent of survival. The animals were restless but alive, and in the center aisle, Clara was already working. She was trying to pitch fresh straw into the mare's stall, but her movements were wrong. The mechanical, punishing efficiency she usually possessed was gone. Her left arm hung stiffly at her side, and she was using only her right arm and the leverage of her hip to maneuver the heavy wooden pitchfork. Caleb watched her for a moment from the shadows. Every time she lifted the fork, a sharp, involuntary hiss escaped her lips, quickly swallowed and buried. She was hiding the pain, treating it as a weakness that the frontier would exploit. Caleb walked over and wrapped his large, leather-clad hand around the handle of the pitchfork, stopping her mid-swing. "Let it go, Vance," he said quietly. Clara's head snapped up, her gray eyes defensive. "The mare needs dry bedding. Frostbite will set into her hooves if she stands in the wet." "I know," Caleb said, his grip on the wood immovable. "And I have 2 working arms to do it. You don't. Let go of the fork." She hesitated, her jaw tight, but the exhaustion in her face won out. She released the wood and took a step back, her left hand coming up to cradle her shoulder. "Go to the cabin," Caleb ordered, his voice lacking its usual gruff edge. It was an instruction, not a command. "Get the stove burning hot. Put the kettle on. I'll be up when the stalls are cleared." Clara looked like she wanted to argue, to prove she wasn't broken, but a sudden tremor ran through her slender frame. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and walked out into the blinding snow. It took Caleb an hour to finish the chores. When he finally stomped the snow from his boots and entered the cabin, the air was blessedly thick with heat. The iron belly of the stove was glowing a dull, angry orange. Clara was sitting at the scarred wooden table. She had managed to peel off the oversized men's coat, but she was still wearing her flannel shirt. She sat rigidly, her left arm resting on her lap, staring into the middle distance. Caleb didn't speak. He went to the small pantry and pulled down a dusty canvas sack. He brought it to the counter, untied the leather string, and pulled out a handful of dried, curled strips of bark, willow bark. His mother used to harvest it by the creek every spring. It tasted like dirt and old pennies, but it chewed the edge off a fever and killed the fire in inflamed joints. He dropped the bark into a tin cup and poured the boiling water over it. He then took a clean, heavy cotton rag from a drawer and soaked it in the remaining hot water from the kettle, wringing it out until it steamed in the cold air of the kitchen. He walked over to the table and set the tin cup in front of her. "Drink it. It's willow bark. It'll taste like a swamp, but it will dull the throbbing." Clara looked at the dark, murky liquid, then up at him. "I'm fine, Caleb. You took the weight of a rotting oak roof on your shoulder last night," Caleb stated, pulling out the chair beside her and sitting down. "You are not fine. Now drink." She picked up the cup with her good hand and took a sip. Her face contorted at the bitter taste, but she swallowed it down. "Now," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet register, "unbutton the collar." Clara froze. The protective walls she had built around herself slammed shut so fast, Caleb could almost hear them click into place. "Excuse me?" "The shoulder, Clara," Caleb said softly, holding up the steaming cotton rag. "The muscle is knotted. If the blood doesn't flow, it will stiffen, and you won't be able to lift a spoon by tomorrow, let alone an axe. I need to put the heat on it. I'm not asking you to strip. Just loosen the collar and pull it off the shoulder." She stared at him, calculating the risk. Trust was not something Clara Vance afforded easily. It was a currency she had been robbed of too many times. But she looked into Caleb's eyes, the dark, exhausted eyes of a man who had stood between her and the law. A man who had confessed his own foolishness just hours before. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she undid the top 3 bone buttons of her flannel shirt. She slipped the fabric over her left shoulder, exposing the skin. Caleb drew in a sharp breath. The bruise was massive. It spread from the base of her neck down over her collarbone and deep into the socket of her shoulder. It was a violent canvas of black, deep purple and angry, swelling red. It looked like she had been struck with a sledgehammer. And beneath the fresh, vivid colors of the roof beam's damage, Caleb's eye caught the faint, faded yellow shadows of older bruises fading into her ribs. The ghosts of New York. The heavy hand of the husband who owned the $15,000 paper. Caleb felt a surge of violent anger, hot and metallic in his throat, but he swallowed it down. This was not the time for his rage. "This is going to burn at first," Caleb warned quietly. He pressed the steaming rag gently against the darkest part of the bruise. Clara gasped, her good hand gripping the edge of the wooden table so hard her knuckles turned white. But she didn't pull away. "Breathe," Caleb murmured. His hands, massive and rough with calluses, were remarkably gentle. He didn't treat her like glass. He treated her like a fellow soldier who had taken a bullet on the front line. He began to massage the heat into the surrounding muscles, his thumbs working the knots at the base of her neck. "My father," Caleb began, the words slow and deliberate in the quiet cabin, "was a hard man. He believed that if a man wasn't suffering, he wasn't working. He looked at this valley and saw an empire, and he didn't care who he had to crush to build it." Clara kept her eyes fixed on the grain of the wood in the table, but she was listening. The heat from the rag was beginning to seep into the bone, bringing a painful, agonizing relief. "When I found out your name," Caleb continued, his thumb moving in slow, rhythmic circles over her uninjured collarbone, "when I realized he took this land from your family, I felt like I was wearing a stolen coat. I still do. I was angry at you yesterday, not just because of the money. I was angry because looking at you made me realize I'm defending a graveyard built on a thief's foundation." "My father wasn't a saint, Caleb," Clara said, her voice raspy. "He drank away the profits and gambled the harvest before it was even planted. Your father bought the paper legally, cruelly, but legally. Legal doesn't make it right, Caleb said. No, Clara agreed, a bitter smile touching her lips. It rarely does. My husband is a judge, Caleb. He knows the law better than God. When he broke my ribs the first time, he told me that under the laws of coverture, a husband has the right to use moderate physical correction to maintain harmony in the household. He beat me with the very law books he swore to uphold. Caleb's hands stopped moving for a fraction of a second. The urge to find this judge, to put him in the dirt of the lower pasture and let the frost do its work, was overwhelming. But he kept his hands steady, reapplying the heat. How did you get away? Caleb asked softly. I stole from him, Clara said, her chin lifting with that familiar defiance. I waited until he was presiding over a long trial in Albany. I broke into his safe. I took my father's land deed, the stock ledgers, and that bank draft. It was my mother's inheritance, meant for me, which he legally absorbed on our wedding day. I knew I couldn't cash it, but I took it anyway because taking it meant he couldn't have it. She looked up at him, her gray eyes burning. I didn't come here to steal your ranch, Caleb. I came here because this land is the only place in the world where the dirt doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It just cares if you can survive. Caleb removed the cooling rag. He looked down at her. The iron walls between them were gone. They were just two people, stripped of their pride, sharing the same fire. We are going to survive, Caleb said, the words a vow etched in stone. Thorne thinks he holds all the cards, but he doesn't know you, and he doesn't know what I'm willing to do to keep you safe. Clara reached up, pulling her shirt collar back over her shoulder. She didn't button it. She just looked at him, the silence stretching between them, thick with a profound, unspoken understanding. It wasn't romance. It was something deeper, something forged in ice and pain. It was absolute, unwavering solidarity. By the end of the week, the thaw had begun, turning the roads into rivers of thick, sucking mud. But the pantry was empty. The coffee tin held only rust. The flour sack was nothing but dust. And they needed iron nails to permanently secure the barn roof before the next snow. They had to go to Blackwood. Caleb hitched the team to the wagon in silence. The atmosphere was heavy. Leaving the ranch meant stepping out of their isolated fortress and into the judging eyes of the world. For Clara, it meant risking exposure. Keep the scarf up, Caleb said as he helped her up onto the wooden bench of the wagon. Pull the hat down. Blackwood is small, but travelers pass through. You let me do the talking. The ride to town was miserable. The wagon wheels sank deep into the mud, the horses straining against the leather traces. When they finally crested the hill and saw the gray, smoke-stained buildings of Blackwood, Caleb felt his stomach tighten. He pulled the wagon up in front of Miller's Mercantile. The boardwalk was relatively quiet, but eyes were already turning. Caleb Sterling was a known dead man walking in this town. His credit was ruined, his reputation in tatters. And now he had a woman sitting next to him on the wagon box, a woman wearing a man's coat and heavy boots. Wait here, Caleb said, stepping down into the mud. No, Clara replied, her voice firm. She climbed down beside him. I'm not a dog you leave tied to a post. We go in together. Caleb sighed, but he didn't argue. He understood the need to stand on her own 2 feet. They walked into the Mercantile. The bell above the door jingled cheerily, a sound completely at odds with the tension in the room. The smell of oiled floorboards, roasted coffee beans, and cured leather hit them. Mr. Miller, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanently suspicious squint, looked up from his ledger. His eyes flicked from Caleb to Clara, taking in her bruised face, her men's clothing, and the dirt under her fingernails. His lip curled slightly. Sterling, Miller said, not offering a greeting. I thought you'd have packed up by now. Bank says you've only got 2 weeks left. I'm still here, Miller, Caleb said, his voice flat. I need 50 pounds of flour, a tin of coffee, salt, and 10 pounds of 10-penny nails. Miller crossed his arms over his apron. That's about $4 worth of goods, Caleb. I told you last month I'm not extending your credit. Cash on the barrel, or you walk out empty-handed. Two local ranchers, leaning against the pickle barrels in the back, stopped their conversation to watch. The silence in the store was oppressive, thick with the town's collective judgment. Look at the failure. Look at the drifter woman he dragged in. Clara felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She knew Caleb had no money. She knew exactly what was in his pockets: lint and dust. She stepped forward, her hand moving toward the inner pocket of her coat, where she kept a small silver brooch she had hidden from her husband. She could trade it. Before she could move, Caleb reached into his canvas coat. He didn't pull out coins. He pulled out a heavy, solid, gold hunter case pocket watch. It hung from a braided chain. The gold was worn smooth from years of handling. Clara stopped breathing. She knew that watch. She had seen Caleb wind it every night by the fire. It was his grandfather's watch, the only piece of the Sterling family legacy that wasn't mortgaged to Silas Thorne. It was his pride, cast in gold. Caleb set the watch on the wooden counter. It made a heavy, definitive thunk. Miller's eyes widened. He picked up the watch, turning it over, popping the latch to inspect the intricate brass gears inside. "This is solid," Miller muttered. "I can give you $15 in store credit for it." "The watch is worth $40, Caleb said coldly. "And I don't want store credit. I want the flour, the salt, the nails, the coffee. And—" Caleb turned his head, his eyes scanning the back wall of the store. He pointed to a heavy, fleece-lined canvas winter coat hanging from a peg. A woman's coat. A real one, built for the frontier, not for a parlor. "And I want that coat. The rest you give me in cash." Clara stared at him, her heart slamming against her ribs. He was selling his legacy. He was giving up the last piece of his family's honor to feed her, to clothe her, to keep them fighting. "Caleb, no," Clara whispered, stepping close to him. "Not the watch. You can't." "It's just metal, Vance," Caleb said softly, not looking at her, keeping his eyes locked on Miller. "It doesn't keep the rain off, and it doesn't bake bread. We need the supplies." Miller smirked, sensing the desperation, but a good deal was a good deal. "Fine. The supplies, the coat, and $8 cash. That's my final offer." "Deal," Caleb said. They loaded the wagon in silence. Caleb handed Clara the new canvas coat. It was thick, warm, and smelled of lanolin. She held it against her chest, the weight of his sacrifice pressing down on her tighter than the law ever had. As Caleb was tying down the flour sack, a smooth, cultured voice drifted over the muddy street. "Selling family heirlooms, Caleb? How the mighty have fallen." Silas Thorne was standing on the boardwalk outside the bank across the street, smoking a cigar. He stepped down into the mud, walking toward the wagon with a leisurely, predatory stride. Beside him was a man Caleb didn't recognize, a man wearing a bowler hat and a city suit, completely out of place in Blackwood. Caleb stepped in front of Clara, shielding her from view. "Mind your own business, Silas." Thorne stopped a few feet away, blowing a ring of gray smoke into the cold air. "Oh, but your business is my business, Caleb. Everything you own is my business. Or at least it will be in 14 days. Thorne's eyes shifted, trying to peer around Caleb to look at Clara. "I received an interesting telegraph this morning," Thorne said, his voice dropping into a conversational, deadly tone, "from a colleague in New York. It seems a prominent judge back east has misplaced his wife, a woman fitting the description of your hired hand. The judge is offering a very generous bounty for her safe return. He even sent a Pinkerton agent to survey the rail lines." Thorne gestured to the man in the bowler hat standing behind him. The man tipped his hat slightly, his eyes cold and calculating. Clara's blood ran to ice, her hands clamped down on the wooden side of the wagon. They found her. The vastness of the frontier hadn't been enough. The law was reaching its long, suffocating fingers into the dirt of Montana to drag her back. Now, Thorne smiled, an ugly, triumphant expression. I am a man of business, Caleb. Harboring a fugitive is a federal crime. If the sheriff were to find out that you are hiding a runaway wife, well, the bank wouldn't even need to wait 2 weeks to seize the property. You'd be in a cell by sunset. The threat was clear. Hand her over, or lose everything today. Caleb didn't draw his gun. He didn't shout. He simply stood taller, his broad shoulders blocking Thorne's view completely. I don't know what you're talking about, Silas, Caleb said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. This woman is my business partner. She signed a contract of employment. If your Pinkerton friend wants to question her, he can ride out to my land with a federal warrant signed by a circuit judge. Until then, if you or your city dog set foot on Sterling property, I will shoot you both for trespassing and bury you in the lower creek. Thorne's smile vanished. The Pinkerton agent shifted nervously, his hand dropping toward his coat pocket. Caleb didn't blink. He stared Thorne down, radiating a violence that was entirely primitive and unyielding. Get in the wagon, Clara, Caleb said quietly. Clara scrambled up onto the bench. Caleb climbed up beside her, took the reins, and snapped them hard. The horses lunged forward, the heavy wagon wheels throwing mud onto Thorne's polished boots as they rolled past. They rode out of Blackwood in absolute silence. The battle lines were no longer drawn in ledgers and bank drafts. The outside world had invaded, and it brought the threat of chains. Caleb had sacrificed his past to buy them time, but as they rode back toward the dying ranch, Clara realized with a crushing despair that against the law, the bank, and the Pinkertons, time was the one thing they couldn't afford. The real war had just begun. The journey back from Blackwood was not measured in miles, but in the agonizing, rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves against the freezing mud. The sky above them was the color of bruised iron, pressing down on the valley with a suffocating weight. Neither Caleb nor Clara spoke. The silence between them was no longer the companionable quiet of shared labor. It was the tense, vibrating silence of a drawn bowstring. Clara sat rigidly on the wagon bench, the new fleece-lined canvas coat folded over her lap. It felt heavier than lead. It felt like a gravestone. Caleb had traded the last piece of his family's honor, his grandfather's gold watch, for her warmth, and in return she had brought the federal law to his doorstep. She looked at Caleb out of the corner of her eye. His jaw was locked, the muscles working rhythmically beneath the rough stubble of his cheek. He held the reins with a white-knuckled grip, his eyes scanning the tree line not for stray cattle, but for the glint of a Pinkerton rifle. He was no longer a rancher fighting the dirt. He was a man preparing for a war he could not possibly win. When they finally reached the yard of the Sterling ranch, dusk had already fallen. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the barn, unhitched the team in silence, and led them to their stalls. He didn't ask Clara to help. He didn't look at her. He just worked with a grim, mechanical intensity. Later, inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasted coffee, and impending doom. Clara stood by the stove, watching as Caleb cleared the scarred wooden table. He didn't set it for dinner. Instead, he went to the locked wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a heavy canvas roll. He brought it to the table, untied the leather straps, and rolled it open. Inside were the disassembled pieces of a heavy-caliber Winchester repeating rifle, a box of brass cartridges, a tin of gun oil, and a bundle of clean rags. Clara felt the breath leave her lungs. The reality of the situation crystallized in the dim lantern light. Caleb sat down heavily in his chair. He picked up the barrel of the rifle, dipped a rag into the oil, and began to slide it methodically down the bore. The sharp, metallic scent of the oil cut through the smell of the coffee, stinging Clara's nose. It was the smell of violence. "You can't do this, Caleb," Clara whispered. Her voice sounded thin, frail against the heavy, rhythmic shk-shk of the oiled rag against steel. Caleb didn't stop moving. He didn't look up. "I'm just cleaning a rifle, Vance. A man ought to keep his tools sharp. He is a Pinkerton agent, Clara said, stepping away from the stove, her hands trembling as she approached the table. He has a federal warrant. If he rides onto this property and you point that rifle at him, they won't just foreclose on the ranch. They will hang you in the center of Blackwood, and Silas Thorne will sell tickets to watch. Caleb paused. He set the barrel down gently on the canvas. He looked up at her, his dark eyes catching the flicker of the lantern flame. They were completely devoid of fear. That was what terrified Clara the most. There was no panic in him, only a cold, absolute resolve. "My father," Caleb said slowly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "spent his whole life bowing to banks, to judges, to men in fine suits who lived 1,000 miles away. He thought if he played by their rules, they would let him keep his kingdom. And they bled him dry anyway." He picked up the receiver of the rifle, his large thumbs expertly checking the firing pin. "I am done bowing, Clara," he continued. "Thorne thinks he can use the law like a whip to make me surrender my land, and use it like a chain to drag you back to a man who beats you. The law hasn't done a damn thing for either of us, so if that city dog steps onto my dirt, he steps out of the law's jurisdiction and into mine." "It's not your fight," Clara cried, her voice breaking, the iron control she had maintained for weeks finally shattering. "Caleb, you don't understand what my husband is capable of. He is a judge of the state of New York. He doesn't just want me back, he wants me broken. He wants to make an example of me. If you stand between us, he will crush you to dust, and he will enjoy doing it." She reached across the table, grabbing his wrist. Her fingers were cold, pressing into the thick tendons of his forearm. "Let them have me," she pleaded, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. Tears, hot and humiliating, finally spilled over her lower lashes, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Take the wagon. Go into town tomorrow. Tell Thorne you didn't know who I was. Tell him you found out, and you are turning me over to the agent. Thorne promised to forgive your debt if you gave me up. You can keep the ranch. You can survive this." Caleb stared at her hand on his wrist. Then he looked at her face, mapped with the fading bruises of her past and the fresh tears of her present. He slowly pulled his arm out of her grasp. He stood up from the table. The chair scraped harshly against the floorboards. He walked around the table until he was standing inches from her. He looked down into her terrified gray eyes. "Do you think so little of me?" Caleb asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. Clara stepped back, startled by the sheer, contained agony in his tone. "What?" "Do you really think," Caleb said, taking another step toward her, his presence overwhelming the small space of the kitchen, "that my price is a patch of frozen dirt? Do you think I could hand a woman over to a monster, watch her get locked in a cage, and then sleep soundly in this cabin just because I have a piece of paper that says the land is mine?" "It's your home," Clara argued, her chest heaving. "It's your family's legacy." "My family's legacy is a lie," Caleb roared, the sudden volume making the lantern glass rattle. He pointed a massive finger toward the floorboards. "This house is built on your father's ruin. The only decent thing this land has seen in 40 years is you. You walking through a blizzard to save a calf. You throwing your shoulder out to hold up a rotting roof. You." He stopped, his chest heaving, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath, fighting to control the violent storm raging inside him. When he opened his eyes, the anger was gone, replaced by a vulnerability so raw it made Clara ache to look at it. "If I let them take you," Caleb said quietly, "I am no better than Silas Thorne. I am no better than your husband. I would be trading a human life for property. I did that once today with a gold watch. I will not do it with a person." He reached out, his calloused fingertips gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was feather light. a stark contrast to the heavy violence he had been preparing for moments ago. "I choose you, Clara," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a solemn oath. "I don't care about the bank. I don't care about the Pinkertons. I draw the line here, on this dirt. And nobody is taking you anywhere unless they put me in the ground first." Clara stared at him, her heart shattering into 1,000 irrecoverable pieces. It was the most beautiful, devastating thing anyone had ever said to her. He wasn't declaring ownership. He was declaring an absolute, unconditional defense of her humanity. And that was exactly why she couldn't let him do it. If he didn't care about his own life, she had to care for him. She had to be the one to sever the tie, to save the lonely rancher from his own nobility. Clara looked down, breaking eye contact. She couldn't let him see the lie forming in her mind. "Okay," she whispered softly, stepping back from his touch. "Okay, Caleb. We fight." Caleb exhaled a long breath, the tension visibly draining from his broad shoulders. He gave her a single, tired nod, then turned back to the table to finish assembling the rifle. Clara went to her bedroll in the corner of the cabin. She lay down, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes. But she didn't sleep. She listened. She listened to the metallic click-clack of Caleb testing the lever action of the Winchester. She listened to the scrape of his boots as he paced the floorboards, checking the heavy wooden shutters on the windows. She listened to the fire popping and hissing in the stove, slowly dying down to embers as the hours crawled by. It was past 2 in the morning when the cabin finally fell silent. Caleb had sat down in the armchair by the door, the loaded rifle resting across his knees, intending to keep watch. But the exhaustion of the past weeks, the physical toll of the cold, and the emotional drain of the day had finally overcome him. His head rested against the back of the chair, his breathing deep and even. Clara lay still for another 20 minutes, making absolutely sure he was asleep. Then, moving with the agonizing slowness of a ghost, she slipped out from under the blanket. She didn't put on the new fleece-lined coat Caleb had bought her. That belonged here. It was bought with sterling gold, and she wouldn't steal it from him. Instead, she pulled on her old, battered men's coat, shivering as the chilled fabric settled over her shoulders. She picked up her worn leather satchel. She moved to the wooden table. In the faint red glow of the dying stove embers, she found a scrap of brown wrapping paper and the stub of a carpenter's pencil. Her hand shook so violently she could barely hold the wood, but she forced herself to write. "Caleb, you gave me my dignity back. I cannot repay that by taking your life. Do not follow me. The law will have its pound of flesh, but it will not be yours. Keep the land. Keep your soul, Clara." She placed the velvet box containing the $15,000 bank draft on top of the note. It was useless paper, but she left it there as a symbol. She was leaving the chains behind. She walked toward the door. As she passed Caleb, she paused. He looked so worn, the deep lines around his eyes etched with a permanent sorrow. She desperately wanted to reach out, to brush the dark hair from his forehead, to memorize the warmth of his skin one last time. But she knew if she touched him, he would wake. And if he woke, she would never have the strength to leave. Clara closed her eyes, swallowed a sob that threatened to tear her throat apart, and silently lifted the iron latch of the door. She slipped out into the biting wind, pulling the door shut behind her until it clicked. The night was a vast, unforgiving ocean of black and white. The cold immediately sank its teeth into her bones, biting through the thin wool of her old coat. The moon was hidden behind thick, rolling clouds, leaving only the faint, eerie luminescence of the snow to guide her. She began to walk. She didn't head toward the barn to saddle a horse. The horses belonged to Caleb, and she wouldn't be accused of horse thieving on top of everything else. Furthermore, a horse would leave deep tracks. A person could disappear into the tree line and become a phantom. She headed east, toward the jagged silhouette of the mountain pass that led to Blackwood. 6 miles. 6 miles in the dark, in the freezing cold, toward her own execution. With every step, Her boots crunched loudly in the crusty snow, a rhythmic drumbeat marching her back to hell. Her mind raced, tormenting her with visions of what awaited her. She saw her husband's cold, manicured hands. She felt the heavy leather spine of his law books crashing against her ribs. She saw the walls of the elegant, suffocating bedroom in New York where she would be locked away, a prized possession put back on her shelf until she withered and died. The terror was so absolute it made her physically nauseous. She stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard to her knees in a snowdrift. The ice burned her skin, but the pain was distant, muted by the roaring in her ears. "I can't go back," her mind screamed. "I'd rather let the frost take me." She looked around the empty, silent woods. She could just lie down here. She could let the cold seep in, let the exhaustion take over. In an hour, it would be painless. She would fall asleep, and the Pinkertons would find nothing but a frozen statue. Caleb would be safe, and her husband would be denied his victory. But as she looked at the snow, she remembered Caleb's hands working the hot rag into her bruised shoulder. She remembered the fierce, unyielding light in his eyes when he stood in front of Silas Thorne's buggy. "I choose you." He hadn't chosen a ghost. He had chosen a survivor. If she died in the snow, she was letting the fear win. If she went back to her husband, she was surrendering her humanity. Clara pushed herself up from the snow, her chest heaving, her breath pluming white in the darkness. She wouldn't freeze. And she wouldn't surrender. She didn't know how she was going to fight the Pinkerton agent. She had no money, no weapons, and no legal standing. But she possessed the one thing Caleb had given her, the absolute conviction that her life was worth fighting for. She adjusted the strap of her satchel and kept walking, disappearing into the dark timberline, a solitary figure raging against the dying of the light. Inside the cabin, the embers in the stove finally gave out with a soft hiss. The sudden drop in temperature is what did it. Caleb shifted in the armchair. The cold air seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, curling around his ankles. He let out a low groan, rolling his neck, feeling the stiff, protesting muscles. He opened his eyes. The cabin was pitch black. Instinct, honed by years of living on the edge of disaster, flooded his veins with ice water. He didn't stretch. He didn't yawn. He gripped the Winchester tightly and sat up straight. "Vance," he whispered, his voice rough with sleep. There was no answer, just the hollow sound of the wind against the logs. Caleb stood up. He moved to the stove, grabbing a lucifer match from the tin box, and struck it against the iron. The small flare of sulfur illuminated the room. He lit the lantern. The yellow light chased the shadows into the corners. He turned to the bedroll in the corner. It was empty. The blankets were folded neatly. Panic, cold and sharp as a butcher's knife, slid between his ribs. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides. "Clara!" he yelled, the name tearing from his throat. He spun around, his eyes sweeping the room, desperate for a sign, an explanation. His gaze fell upon the wooden table. There, illuminated by the lantern, was the velvet box, and beneath it the scrap of brown paper. Caleb dropped the rifle. It hit the floorboards with a heavy clatter, ignored. He snatched up the paper, his massive hands trembling so badly he could barely read the pencil scratches. "The law will have its pound of flesh, but it will not be yours. Do not follow me." "No," Caleb breathed, the word a strangled gasp. "No, no, no." He crushed the paper in his fist. He understood immediately what she had done. She had sacrificed herself to save him. She was walking into the jaws of the beast to spare the hunter. He looked at the new canvas coat, still sitting on the bench by the door. She had walked out into a freezing Montana night with nothing but a ragged men's coat and a broken heart. Caleb didn't bother putting on his gloves. He didn't bother grabbing a scarf. He snatched the Winchester from the floor, kicked the cabin door open, and ran out into the night. The wind hit him like a physical blow, but he didn't feel the cold. He felt nothing but a roaring, blinding terror. He sprinted to the barn, his boots sliding in the mud and snow. He grabbed a lantern from the wall, lit it with trembling hands, and brought it low to the ground. There they were, Small, deliberate boot prints leading away from the cabin, cutting a straight line toward the eastern tree line, toward Blackwood. Caleb looked out into the vast, dark expanse of the wilderness. The tracks were already beginning to blur as the wind whipped the loose snow across the crust. In an hour, they would be gone completely. "You foolish, brave woman," Caleb whispered into the dark, his voice cracking. He didn't run back for a horse. A horse would break its leg in the hidden gopher holes and ice ruts in the dark. He had to follow her on foot. He gripped the lantern in his left hand and the heavy rifle in his right. He stepped into her footprints, his massive boots swallowing the delicate impressions she had left behind. He began to track her. This was his darkest night. The debt, the bank, the failing ranch, none of it mattered. It was all dust in the wind. The only thing that mattered in the entire universe was the woman walking toward her own destruction in the freezing dark. Caleb Sterling pushed himself into a relentless, grueling jog, following the ghosts in the snow, praying to a God he hadn't spoken to in years that he wouldn't be too late. The trail was a jagged scar across the pristine canvas of the Montana wilderness. Caleb tracked her not by sight, but by sheer desperate instinct. The wind had already begun to sweep the loose crystalline powder over her footprints, rounding the sharp edges of her boots into shallow, shapeless depressions. He moved through the timberline like a hunted wolf, his breathing a harsh, ragged rasp that tore at his throat. The cold was a physical entity now, a heavy, suffocating blanket that sought to drag him down into the snow, but the fire in his chest burned hotter. He had to reach her. He had to reach her before the road descended into the valley, before the long arm of the law could close its iron fingers around her wrists. Miles blurred into an agonizing loop of dark trees and blinding white snow. His legs felt like lead. His lungs burned with the taste of copper. But he did not slow down. He gripped the heavy walnut stock of the Winchester rifle until his knuckles ached, the cold metal biting through his calluses. As the dense canopy of the pines began to break, giving way to the pale, bruised gray of the pre-dawn sky, Caleb heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, rhythmic crack of a leather whip and the heavy, plunging sound of horses fighting through deep drifts. Caleb dropped to his knees behind a massive snow-laden cedar, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peered through the frosted branches. About 50 yards below, on the winding county road that led to Blackwood, a heavy, black-enclosed carriage had ground to a halt. The horses were lathered in sweat, their breath pluming in massive white clouds. Silas Thorne stood near the carriage door, swathed in his expensive astrakhan coat. Beside him, standing in the ankle-deep mud and snow, was the Pinkerton agent, Hayes, holding a pair of heavy iron shackles. And standing 10 feet away from them, illuminated by the harsh yellow glare of the carriage lanterns, was Clara. She looked impossibly small against the vastness of the frozen road. Her ragged men's coat offered no protection against the biting wind. She was trembling violently, her arms wrapped around her torso, but her head was held high. She had not been caught. She had walked directly into their path, standing in the center of the road to stop the carriage. "You are making the right choice, Mrs. Vance," the Pinkerton agent said, his voice a smooth, practiced drone that carried over the wind. "Or should I say, Mrs. Sterling? No, that's not right either. Your husband has been quite frantic. He merely wants you safely returned to New York. The carriage is heated. Step inside." Clara didn't move. She looked past the agent, her gray eyes locking onto Silas Thorne. "I am not going anywhere until you give me the paper, Thorne," Clara said, her voice raspy, fighting against the violent chattering of her teeth. "The cancellation of the Sterling debt. You promised to forgive the loan if I turned myself in. Hand it to me, now." Thorne let out a short, condescending laugh. He reached into his inner pocket, pulling out a folded piece of heavy parchment. "You possess a remarkable sense of nobility for a woman in your position, my dear. A true martyr. But business is business. You surrender to Agent Hayes, and I will leave Caleb Sterling to freeze on his worthless dirt in peace." He held the paper out, but he didn't step forward. He wanted her to walk to him. He wanted her to submit. Clara took a slow, agonizing step forward, her boot crunching in the snow. She reached her trembling hand out toward the document. "Don't touch it, Clara." The voice tore through the quiet dawn like a cannon shot. Clara spun around. Thorne flinched, and the Pinkerton agent instantly dropped his hand to the heavy revolver holstered at his hip. Caleb stepped out from the tree line, a towering, terrifying silhouette against the rising sun. He was covered in snow, his chest heaving, his face a mask of absolute, unyielding violence. And the barrel of the Winchester was leveled directly at the center of the Pinkerton agent's chest. "Caleb, no!" Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "I made a deal! Let them have me!" "The deal is dead," Caleb roared, taking a slow, heavy step down the embankment. "Step away from her, Silas." Agent Hayes drew his revolver in a flash of blued steel, aiming it at Caleb's head. "Drop the rifle, rancher. You're interfering with a federal warrant. I have the authority to shoot you where you stand." "Then shoot," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly gravel. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He walked steadily down the slope until he was standing just 10 feet away from the carriage. "Shoot me, city boy. But I promise you, the lever on this Winchester is hair-triggered. The moment your bullet hits me, my finger twitches, and my .44 caliber slug is going to tear a hole through your chest the size of a dinner plate. We die together in the snow. Is the bounty worth your life?" Hayes hesitated. He was a professional, a man who hunted desperate people for a living. But as he looked into Caleb Sterling's dark, exhausted eyes, he recognized something he rarely saw. A man who truly had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. Caleb had already made peace with death. He was simply negotiating the terms of who was coming with him. "Caleb, please," Clara begged, stepping between Caleb and the agent, her hands raised. "You are throwing your life away for nothing. I have nothing. I am legally dead." "You are my partner," Caleb said, his eyes never leaving the Pinkerton. "And I don't abandon my partners to thieves." Silas Thorne, realizing the situation was spiraling out of control, stepped behind the heavy wooden door of the carriage. "This is madness, Sterling. You are bankrupt. You are facing the gallows. For what? A runaway wife who lied to you?" "I didn't lie to him, Thorne," Clara suddenly said. The desperate panic in her voice vanished. The trembling stopped. She stood up straighter, turning her back to Caleb's rifle, and faced the banker. The vulnerability she had shown moments ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating intellect that made Caleb lower the rifle a fraction of an inch. "I never lied about why I came to the Sterling Ranch," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and sharp in the frigid morning air. "I told Caleb I came for work, but I didn't tell you what kind of work, Silas." Thorne frowned, his grip tightening on the carriage door. "What are you babbling about, woman?" Clara reached into the pocket of her battered coat. She didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, tightly rolled tube of heavy canvas-backed paper, tied with a faded red ribbon. "When my husband locked me in his study," Clara said, her eyes locked on Thorne with a predatory intensity, "I had nothing to do but read. He kept the original land patents for half the Western Territories in his safe. He used them to broker illicit railroad deals. When I broke into his safe to take my mother's money, I didn't just take the bank draft. I took the original federal land patent for the Blackwood Valley, the patent issued in 1845, the one my father discovered before your bank stole this land from him." Thorne's face lost a fraction of its color. "That document is a forgery. The bank holds the deed to the Sterling property. It is legally bound collateral." "The bank holds a deed issued by a corrupt state surveyor in 1860, Clara corrected, her voice dripping with venom. "But federal law supersedes state law, Silas. And according to this original patent, signed by the President of the United States, the northern boundary of the Blackwood Valley, which includes the entirety of the Sterling Ranch, was perpetually designated as protected watershed territory under the Treaty of 1840. It cannot be bought, it cannot be sold, and it absolutely cannot be leveraged as collateral by a private bank." The silence on the road was absolute. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Caleb stared at Clara, the pieces suddenly falling into place. The late nights in the barn, the way she scrutinized the fence lines, the careful, methodical way she had asked about the history of his father's loans. She hadn't just been surviving, she had been excavating. She had been digging up the legal foundation of Thorne's entire empire. "You're bluffing," Thorne spat, though a bead of sweat broke out on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. "Am I?" Clara stepped closer, waving the rolled document. "If the federal government finds out you have been issuing mortgages and seizing property on protected federal land, they won't just shut down your bank, Silas. They will charge you with federal fraud. You will spend the rest of your life breaking rocks in a penitentiary. Your Chicago buyers will withdraw, your assets will be seized, and you will be ruined." She turned her gaze to the Pinkerton agent, who was still holding his revolver, though his aim had wavered. "And you, Mr. Hayes," Clara said smoothly. "My husband sent you. Did he tell you why he was so desperate to get me back? It wasn't love. It was because I mailed a copy of his private ledger, the one detailing his bribes from the railroad barons, to a journalist at the New York Tribune. If I don't send a telegraph every 2 weeks confirming I am alive and free, the ledger goes to the front page. My husband is currently sitting on a powder keg. If you take me back, you are walking into a federal indictment." Agent Hayes slowly lowered his revolver. He was a mercenary, not a fool. He looked at Thorne, who was visibly trembling now, and then at Clara. "The judge didn't mention any ledgers," Hayes muttered. "Of course he didn't," Clara replied. "He told you I was a hysterical runaway wife. He lied to you, just like Silas Thorne is lying to the town of Blackwood." Clara took the folded paper from Thorne's frozen, unresisting hand, the cancellation of Caleb's debt. She didn't tear it up. She carefully tucked it into her pocket. "Here are the new terms, gentlemen," Clara said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who had just conquered her demons. "Mr. Hayes, you will return to New York and tell my husband that you lost my trail in the blizzard. You will tell him that Clara Vance is dead to the world, swallowed by the frontier. If he leaves me alone, his secrets remain safe." She turned back to Thorne. "And you, Silas, you will return to your bank. You will register the cancellation of the sterling debt by noon today. You will never set foot on our property again, and you will never mention my name. In return, the federal patent stays in my pocket, and your fraudulent bank stays open. If you cross us, if you so much as look at Caleb Sterling the wrong way, I will burn your empire to the ground." Thorne stared at her, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He looked at Caleb, who was still holding the Winchester, a slow, grim smile spreading across his exhausted face. The banker realized he was utterly defeated. He hadn't been outgunned. He had been outsmarted by a woman he considered property. Without a word, Thorne climbed back into the carriage, slamming the door shut. Agent Hayes holstered his weapon, gave Clara a slow, respectful tip of his hat, and climbed up to the driver's bench. He cracked the whip, and the carriage turned violently in the snow, retreating back down the road toward Blackwood. Caleb and Clara stood alone on the frozen road, the rising sun finally breaking over the mountains, painting the snow in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Caleb slowly lowered the hammer of the rifle. He looked at Clara. She was still holding the rolled patent, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to leave her system. He walked down the embankment. He didn't say anything. He dropped the rifle into the snow, reached out, and pulled her into his arms. He wrapped his massive, heavy coat around her, burying his face in her freezing hair. He held her tight, as if trying to physically absorb her cold, to anchor her to the earth. Clara let out a choked sob, burying her face in his chest, her hands clutching at the thick canvas of his coat. The iron walls she had built around her heart finally, completely shattered. She wasn't crying from fear. She was crying from the overwhelming, terrifying relief of being seen, being defended, and finally, being free. "You foolish woman," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "You brilliant, foolish woman." "I told you," Clara murmured against his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. I'm worth the wages you aren't paying me." Caleb laughed, a real deep, resonant sound that he hadn't made in years. "Yes, partner, you are." They stood there in the road, two broken people who had used the sharp edges of their past to carve out a future. They had fought the land, they had fought the law, and they had won. "Let's go home, Clara," Caleb said quietly, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. Clara looked at him, at the dark, warm eyes of the lonely rancher who had chosen her over his pride. She nodded, a genuine smile finally touching her bruised lips. "Yes," she said, "let's go home." Spring did not arrive in Montana with gentleness. It arrived with the violent, noisy destruction of winter. The ice on the creek shattered with sounds like gunshot. The snow melted into rushing, muddy torrents, and the frozen earth surrendered, turning the valley floor into a rich, dark soup. But for the first time in 3 years, the mud didn't feel like a trap to Caleb Sterling. It smelled like life. Inside the cabin, the heavy wooden shutters were thrown wide open, letting the crisp, pine-scented breeze sweep away the stale soot of winter. At the scarred wooden table, there was no preacher. There was no white lace, no rings, and no vows of obedience. Instead, there was a bottle of dark black ink, a steel-nibbed pen, and a heavy legal document drawn up by a lawyer Clara had discreetly contacted in Helena. It was titled, "Articles of Co-Partnership and Joint Tenancy." Caleb sat in his chair, carefully reading the dense legal script. The document explicitly stated that the land, the livestock, and all profits or debts were to be split equally, 50-50 between Caleb Sterling and Clara Vance. It was an ironclad agreement that circumvented the restrictive marriage laws of the era. It ensured that Clara could never be stripped of her rights, and that Caleb would never rule as a king over a subject. He picked up the pen, dipped it into the inkwell, and signed his name at the bottom in bold, heavy strokes. He slid the paper across the table. Clara looked at it. She was wearing a clean cotton dress she had purchased in town, her hair braided neatly over her shoulder. The bruises on her face had faded to faint, yellowish shadows, but the light in her gray eyes was brighter than the spring sun. She took the pen. Her hand didn't tremble. She signed Clara Vance right next to his name. "Well," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair, a slow, easy smile spreading across his face, "I suppose that makes it official. You own half of the worst dirt in the county." "It's not the worst dirt," Clara replied, carefully blotting the ink. "It just needs someone who knows how to treat it. Which reminds me, the lower pasture fencing isn't going to fix itself, partner." They walked out into the bright afternoon sun. The air was warm, alive with the sound of birds and the distant lowing of the cattle. The crushing weight of Silas Thorne's debt was gone. The Pinkertons were a memory. They had survived the darkest night of their lives, and now they had to do the hard work of living. They headed down to the lower pasture, carrying shovels and a bundle of fresh cedar posts. The old fence line had been decimated by the winter storms. Caleb began to dig the first post hole. The earth was soft, giving way easily under the blade of the shovel. He worked with a steady, relaxed rhythm, his muscles moving fluidly under his canvas shirt. Clara worked beside him, clearing the brush and aligning the posts. There was no rush. There was no desperation. Just the steady, companionable rhythm of shared labor. As Caleb drove the shovel deep into the earth for the fourth hole, the steel blade struck something hard with a dull, metallic clink. He frowned, pausing his work. He scraped the dirt away with the edge of the blade, expecting to find a stubborn piece of granite. Instead, he saw the rusted, corroded edge of a square iron box. "Clara," Caleb called out, dropping to one knee in the mud. "Bring the trowel." Clara hurried over, kneeling beside him in the wet earth. Together, they carefully excavated the object. It was a heavy iron lockbox, the kind used decades ago to store ammunition or valuables. The metal was severely rusted, the hinges fused together by time and moisture. Caleb took his heavy hunting knife from his belt and wedged it under the lid, using his weight to pry it open. With a sharp crack, the rusted latch gave way. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had miraculously preserved the contents from the damp earth, was a small leather-bound journal and a bundle of letters tied with a frayed leather cord. Clara carefully lifted the journal. She opened the delicate yellowed pages. The ink was faded to a pale brown, but the elegant flowing script was still legible. "What is it?" Caleb asked, wiping the mud from his hands. Clara read the first entry silently, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at Caleb, her eyes wide with a profound, quiet awe. "It belongs to a man named Elias," Clara whispered, "and a woman named Sarah. The date is October 14th, 1852. 8 years before your father bought the land," Caleb noted. "Before the bank. Before any of us." Clara nodded, looking back down at the delicate pages. "They weren't homesteaders, Caleb. Sarah was a runaway slave from Missouri. Elias was the man who helped her escape. They came here to hide. They lived on this exact spot, in a dugout cabin, for 3 years before they moved further north to Canada." She gently touched the old, fragile paper. "He wrote that the land was harsh, but it hid them from the bounty hunters. He wrote that the earth didn't care about the color of their skin, or the laws of the men who chased them. It just gave them a place to rest." Caleb sat back on his heels, looking out over the rolling, greening valley. The revelation settled over them like a warm blanket. The Sterling Ranch wasn't just a piece of property that had been stolen and fought over. It was a sanctuary. Long before Caleb's father had tried to build an empire, long before Silas Thorne had tried to turn it into collateral, this soil had been a harbor for outcasts. It had a history of protecting those who had nowhere else to go. "The land remembers," Caleb said softly, his voice thick with reverence. "It always belonged to the runaways." Clara smiled, a deep, peaceful expression. She carefully wrapped the journal back in the oilcloth and placed it gently back into the iron box. "We'll bury it again," she said, "under the new oak tree by the cabin. It's the foundation of this place, the real foundation." They stood up, the rusted box cradled in Clara's arms. The ghosts of the past were no longer burdens. They were companions. They were part of the legacy they were now sworn to protect. Caleb reached down to grab his shovel. As his hand wrapped around the rough wooden handle, a sharp, jagged splinter of cedar drove deep into the meat of his palm. He flinched, a sharp hiss escaping his lips. He instinctively pulled his hand back, curling it into a fist, hiding the injury against his stomach. It was an old habit, the reflex of a man who believed that showing pain was a fatal weakness, a man who believed he had to bleed in silence to be strong. He started to turn away, intending to walk to the creek and dig the splinter out himself with the tip of his knife, alone. But he stopped. He looked at Clara. She was watching him, holding the iron box, her eyes filled not with pity, but with a quiet, unwavering patience. She wasn't judging his weakness, she was simply waiting for him. The lonely rancher, the man who had fought blizzards, banks, and his own pride, took a slow, deep breath. He let his shoulders drop. He uncurled his fist. He walked over to Clara. He didn't say a word. He simply held out his large, dirt-stained, bleeding hand toward her, palm up. It was a profound surrender. It was the absolute admission that he could not, and no longer wanted to, fix everything by himself. Clara looked at his outstretched hand. A soft, tender smile touched her lips. She set the iron box down in the soft spring grass. She took his massive hand in both of hers. Her touch was firm, warm, and incredibly gentle. She examined the splinter, her thumb brushing softly over the calloused skin of his palm. "That's going to need a needle, partner," Clara said, her voice a soothing murmur in the quiet valley, "and some hot water." "I know," Caleb replied, his voice barely a whisper. He looked down at her, feeling the steady, comforting weight of her hands holding his. "Will you fix it?" "I will," Clara promised, her gray eyes locking onto his. shining with the bright, fierce light of a love built on absolute equality. "I've got you, Caleb. We've got each other." They walked back up the hill toward the cabin, leaving the fence posts behind in the mud. The work would always be there. The frontier would always demand its toll. But as they walked side by side under the vast, open expanse of the Montana sky, the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was the quiet, unbreakable peace of a home finally found. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
The tale of Caleb Sterling and Clara Vance is more than a romance set against the rugged backdrop of the 1870s Montana frontier. It is a profound meditation on the enduring power of human dignity and the redemptive nature of unconditional solidarity. At its core, the story explores the concept of value, challenging us to look beyond the cold numbers of a bank ledger or the restrictive definitions of the law to find the true worth of a human soul. The moral center of the story lies in the evolution of Caleb Sterling. We meet a man crushed by the weight of a thief's foundation, a ranch built on the ruin of others. Caleb's journey is one of unlearning the toxic pride of the frontier. He discovers that true strength is not found in silent suffering or isolation, but in the courage to be vulnerable. When Caleb lowers his rifle and chooses Clara over his land, he is making a revolutionary statement that a person's right to freedom and safety is a sacred priority that supersedes property, debt, and even family legacy. Clara Vance represents the indomitable spirit of the survivor. Her arc teaches us about the vital importance of human rights and equality. In an era where the law viewed her as mere property, Clara refused to be a victim. She didn't seek a savior, she sought a partner. Her work was not just physical labor, but the strategic reclamation of her own agency. The story highlights a vital human lesson: that equality is not a gift given by the strong to the weak, but a mutual recognition of worth between two people standing on level ground. Furthermore, the discovery of the hidden journal in the final chapter adds a layer of historical justice and profound educational value. By revealing that the ranch was once a sanctuary for those escaping slavery, the story honors the long, often unseen history of the American West as a place of refuge for the marginalized. It teaches us that the land remembers, that we are merely temporary stewards of a legacy of mercy that predates our own struggles. Ultimately, the lesson of the lonely rancher is one of healing. It teaches us that we are all, in some way, runaways, searching for a home where the dirt doesn't care about our past, only our character. The story's final image, Caleb offering his injured hand to Clara, serves as a beautiful metaphor for a better way to live. It suggests that when we stop trying to outsmart the dirt alone, and instead choose to walk side by side as equals, we finally find the only home that can never be foreclosed upon: the quiet, unbreakable peace of shared humanity.